Good evening, Dark Darlings. Thank you for joining me, Madam Horror, for your bedtime scary stories. Tonight, we have a compilation of my favorite cryptids: Bigfoot, Dogman, and Skinwalkers. Now, hit that like and subscribe button, and we'll dive deeper into the unknown. 1993. I was 9 or 10. My dad worked in janitorial supply distribution center, northern Utah, very rural. Moved there for a couple years. Dad being a salesman, he had to travel around the cities, going directly to schools, churches, hospitals, businesses, trying to sell toilet paper and cleaning supplies in general. One night, he arrived really freaked out. His pickup truck had a dent in the front and a smashed windshield. He was almost crying when he arrived home. My mom thought maybe he might have hit someone in the road or something. Dad was very hesitant to tell me what had happened. He talked in private with my mom, but I was able to overhear the conversation. He was driving in the middle of one of those old roads, still some sunlight, but almost sundown. We saw what looked like a person in the distance. The person was walking towards my dad's pickup truck, middle of the road. The person began waving, trying to get my dad's attention. So Dad pulled aside. When the person got closer, he noticed that the person was covering his face. He felt a bit of intimidation, but did not stop the engine. He just hit the brakes. As the person got closer, he noticed that it wasn't a mask. Or if it was a very realistic one. The person seemed to have a dog face, and as he talked, the dog's mouth also moved. The person seemed to have a dog face, and as he talked, the dog's mouth also moved. My dad was freaking out, thinking that this was some sort of prank, but when it got closer, the person had a human body. Pants, shirt, normal hands. The face was of a dog. Black eyes, ears, and a mouth just like a dog's. The person asked my dad to step out for a moment. He declined, and the person with the dog face tried to open the door. When he looked forward, there was another person with the dog head as well, running towards the truck. My dad hit the gas. He hit the dog person in front of him. The impact cracked the windshield. As he went faster, the two people were running behind his truck. Dad said he was driving like 70+ miles an hour. Still, they were in the rearview mirror. Eventually, he lost sight of him. He couldn't comprehend what he had just seen. He was in shock. He even followed up with the highway police, filed a report and everything. He told everyone his story, even his friends, but he didn't mention the dog face in fear of ridicule. But we've talked in private, and he confirmed to me that those were dog faces. On April 26, 2014, my best friend, 18, and I, 19, were driving back to his house from Bible study at church. It was between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. About a mile and a half or so, turning onto a long country road that led to the small township he lived in, we saw a fire on the left side of the road and into a ditch. We turned around to get a better look and see what was burning. Being in the passenger seat, I was able to look down into the ditch and see nothing burning. There was definitely a large amount of fire that I could see through to the ground, but nothing was on fire. The ground itself appeared to be porous and folding inward. My best friend had to pull my shoulder to get my attention because I could not stop staring at it. A large amount of smoke started to pour out. He began driving away, but we eventually had to turn around to get back to his house at the other end of the road. When we reached the end of the road where we began, I dialed 911 to let them know that there was what appeared to be a gas leak that had caught fire in this ditch. We drove past the fire again, but it had died down a bit. However, now there were smaller little tufts of flame on the ground. One after another, they led away from the ditch. While I was turning around, looking back over my shoulder, my friend slammed onto the brakes, and I heard him say, "What?" Walking horizontally into the road from the trees on the same side of the road that the fire was on was something that does not fit any description of anything I have ever heard from stories before. My brain needs me to itemize its description as I remember noticing them. Black, big as a sedan, on 4 legs, shaggy black fur from its shoulder to its head, emaciated from midsection to tail. Literal black skin stretched around bones and everything behind the shoulders. Canine-like head. Eyes very forward-facing. Eyes are not reflecting light. Large, round, black, and empty. Completely devoid of light. It blinked and the eyeballs were pressed inward, with the lids as they shut. This thing was about 5 to 10 yards away, so I got a very good look at the thing through the high beams. It did not turn to look at the car. Its head was raised up slightly, as if it was looking into the car to look directly at us. I was not particularly afraid or fearful. However, when it looked directly at me, I felt intense feelings of dread and hopelessness being projected at me. My friend floored his old Ford Taurus and whipped it around the back end of the thing, and he drove 65 in a 35 all the way back to his house. As we were driving, I asked him, "What was that?" With tears rolling down his face, he sobbed, "I don't know. I want to go home. I just want to go home." We ran into his house and locked all the doors and windows. When we were finally able to calm down, we did not talk to each other much for the rest of the night. Over the next few days, I would try to relay the event to my family, beginning with, "I saw something the other night," and I couldn't stop telling them everything while choking back sobs. I did not want to tell them. They knew I was not okay. The intense feelings the things put on me were beginning to take its toll. Almost a decade later, and I still haven't read a single story or alleged sighting of anything that matches what I saw. Since then, I've become familiar with regional cryptids and the lore associated with them. It wasn't an apparition of some kind because it blinked. I've not read of any accounts of apparitions blinking or closing or opening their eyes for some desired effect. This thing was definitely existing physically. There is nothing from my state, Indiana, that even comes close to fitting this description. Since then, I've become familiar with regional cryptids and the lore associated with them. It wasn't an apparition of some kind because it blinked. I've not read any accounts of apparitions blinking, only closing or opening their eyes for some desired effect. This thing was definitely existing physically. There is nothing from my state, Indiana, that even comes close to fitting this description. Back in 1961, near Lawton, Oklahoma, I remember waking up during the wee hours in the morning, whilst it was still very dark. I was in my mid-teens. I still recall the partially open window facing the backyard where we kept a crow in a cage. Near there was a hole in the ground. As I looked out the window, I saw a strange figure emerging from that hole. It appeared to be very tall, thin, dark, and had a dog-like head with very pointy ears and a pointed muzzle. I was paralyzed with fear as I watched the thing walk over to the cage, reach right through the chicken wire, and grab the crow. It pulled out a knife from somewhere and, with a quick jab, struck it into the bird, then dropped the dead crow back into its cage. I don't recall anything after that except crawling back into bed and pulling the covers over my head. I stayed there until daylight and desperately needing to pee. Once it was light, I ran for the front door of the house and awakened my parents, telling them something killed the crow and I had seen it. They laughed it off, but assured me the crow was okay, and walked me to the back of our yard where the crow's cage was. The crow was dead. My dad chucked it over the fence into a nearby field and told me the crow froze to death. So, a year has passed since I fully realized they were real, and I'd gotten a couple of friends on board, at least enough to go camping and see what we could find. We ended up at a campground in Lost Creek Wilderness, a little ways northwest of Pikes Peak, Colorado. We really didn't expect to find anything on this trip, and we were skeptical of the signs we came across until the morning. But we did notice a couple of things. In an aspen grove nearby, we found an aspen tree that was broken off at its base. Nearby was an area of matted grass. We also found a few broken off trunks, 8 to 10 feet tall aspen trees, sort of hidden, laying behind some rocks. Later that night, sitting around the fire, one of my friends suddenly said, "Wow, I just saw a flash of light over there." We decided it must have been a headlight shining through the trees from the road in the distance, but I turned around to look in the direction he'd been looking. Then I saw it too. A bright yellow-white circle of light appeared to peek from behind a tree some 20 feet away, briefly coming into view before going back behind the tree. We again chalked it up to being a headlight, but examining the line of sight during the daytime, I don't think that's possible. The road is quite a ways away in that direction, and obscured by many pine trees. If visible, a headlight would be scattered by the pines at least. What I saw was sharply defined and circular. Also, definitely felt watched, but I wasn't into trusting those feelings much at the time, so I brushed it off. The following morning we did a little hike, and as we were getting back to camp, walking along the creek, someone noticed the stick structure on the other side of the creek. For an idea of scale, the tallest tree in the arch is probably 9 to 10 feet. It's not possible to get over there without wading through cold, deep, fast-moving water. We're kind of dumbfounded by this sight because not only how, but why would a person make that? And we're making the connection to the broken-off trees stashed on our side of the creek, not yet placed. And again, why would a person break the tree rather than using an axe? We stand in silence for a while, just thinking, and as I'm staring at this spot in the middle of the creek, a rock splashes directly in the center of my field of view. I asked if my friend saw it, and he said he had. We both thought it was weird. Later, though, he confessed he hadn't actually seen the rock I saw, but had seen one earlier that I didn't notice and just didn't say anything. Our attitude after this first trip was sort of hesitantly amazed. We really hadn't expected anything and weren't really certain yet, but couldn't deny that we had a lot of reason to go back to that exact spot, which we did do 2 days later. This time we did a night hike around midnight. We got a nearby ridge that overlooks a steep, bowl-shaped slope a little ways away. I stopped a bit below the crest to catch my breath, so I was the last one at the top. I reached the top, and almost immediately we all heard a powerful crack, like lightning from the middle of the other slope, followed by the sound of a tree hitting the ground. A tree broke on a perfectly clear, windless night, right as the last member of our group came into earshot of it. I want to leave my subjective interpretation out as much as possible, but this was an incredible moment in my life. The apprehension from the hike through the dark trees instantly vanished. Replaced by awe. God, what a mighty sound! It was like they were telling us, "Don't worry, we're all the way over here, but don't come any closer." I remember my good friend saying, "I thought it would be scary, but it's just cool." And we were all a little slack-jawed and teary-eyed. We tried to knock to them, but the tree break was the only thing we heard that night. The next morning, 2 of us went on a surprise hike, thinking we'd stop at the same ridge, but we ended up going all the way up the peak, right above the campground. On our way down, we found another stick structure. I think I caught a glimpse of one of them peeking out at us from behind a tree while we were hanging out near that structure, but it was far away enough and obscured by pine needles that I couldn't be sure. There were two eyes glowing a pale blue in the early morning darkness, framed by dark brown, with a ring of light brown hair around the face. I could barely make it out, but the thing that kept me staring at it was the peeking motion. One eye, back behind the tree, two eyes, back behind the tree. This was accompanied by a strange chirping noise from that location and another location off to its right. I eventually began to feel very uncomfortable, like we were overstaying our welcome, and insisted that we head back down. I eventually began to feel very uncomfortable, like we were overstaying our welcome, and insisted that we head back down. My folks lived on the edge of the suburbs, just behind the first ridge of the mountains. There was a road just to the south that runs up a canyon and into the mountains. And if you take that just a little ways up to your first left, there's a trail that's not well marked or hiked. It's the backside of a system of trails that are well marked and hiked, and it connects with the system at the top, but is hidden. If you went down from it to the main system, you'd end up far away from your vehicle. It's densely forested, doesn't get much sun, and is almost always snowy, muddy, or both. The first time I brought one of the friends from the Lost Creek expeditions on this trail, we heard knocks, two sharp cracks when we stepped out of the car, and another two when we started hiking up the trail. I don't remember if we heard anything else at that time, but it was enough to get me hiking this trail pretty regularly by myself. Since I was living at my parents' house at the time. Wood knocks and little strange vocals are the things I've heard. There's too many times to list at this point. Even just a few days ago, I took a skeptic friend up there at dusk, and we heard a couple of series of knocks that made him ask, "So those were what you've called wood knocks?" My ma and I hiked it over Thanksgiving and heard a crazy amount of knocks from all over the place while we were hiking the top third of the trail, most I've ever heard. But knocks aren't that exciting and aren't that convincing for skeptics. So let me get to the more interesting things that have happened there. The closest encounter I've had occurred on my way down the trail after I've been hearing little noises on the way up, making me suspect that they were around. I suddenly heard a loud woo from down on my right. I was feeling good, so I went woo back. In immediate response to this, from off to the right came a loud, squawking, screeching sound. I grinned and sat down to see what would happen, and pretty quickly I began to hear what I thought was someone walking their dog up the trail towards me, a quiet panting. But as it got louder and louder and louder, I could only imagine the chest cavity of whatever was making this sound to be utterly massive. Rapid, loud, heavy breathing, and it was close. It sounded like it was within 20 or 30 yards of me, but I couldn't tell where. It definitely scared me. But I had my voice of reason present enough to think, well, okay, I'm pretty sure I know what this is, and what it's trying to tell me. I should just take the hint. I stood up and started walking down the trail, and the huffing stopped. I never saw what was making the sound. I tried to entertain the possibility that this was a bear or a lion for a while, but it just doesn't seem possible. It was bigger than a mountain lion, bigger than a black bear, not to mention neither of those animals seemed like a prime candidate to try and scare me away by breathing heavily while remaining completely hidden. I suspect the initial vocals I heard were bold, curious youngsters, and Dad got nervous and wanted me out of there. It's not the only time I felt like I was being warned to back off there. Near the top of the trail, near a big tree that's been broken and bent to the ground, still alive though, I found a stick structure that's a staple in the Sasquatch repertoire. I went back to my car and snapped those 3 pictures, but I felt really uncomfortable while doing so. It's hard to explain the vibey things that go along with this hobby, but I felt like I was violating them somehow, doing something that they'd strongly disapprove of. I had no indication that they were watching me. It's just a feeling I had. Less than 24 hours later, I hiked the trail again, and just inside the trees at the bottom right of the middle of the trail was a deer skeleton. Fresh skull with 3 vertebrae attached, broken femurs scattered about. I can pretty much guarantee nobody had hiked there since me yesterday, and I had a big feeling that this skeleton was left for me specifically. I decided then and there never to bring a camera with me again, which is a bit of a shame considering the next thing I found. But I want respect for them and their wishes to be my #1 priority. Fortunately, in the picture you can see the aspen tree that served as the base of the structure that I found a week or 2 later in the second picture of the teepee structure. That arch that starts just to the left of the teepee was the base and mouth for a lean-to type structure. At a time in July when we were getting an absurd amount of rain for Colorado. There were sticks placed perpendicular to it, all along the arch, weighing it down so the opening was probably 3 to 4 feet high in the middle. All across these sticks, perpendicular again, so parallel to the arch, were 6-inch by 12-inch strips of aspen bark, making a very impressive roof. Maybe one more thing worth telling on this trail, which is another possible brief sighting, but again, distant and obscured, so I can't be completely sure. I was coming up to the steep spot where I'd heard the breathing, and a crazy amount of loud knocking issued from up the cliff to my left. I had stood there looking up at the slope, and something caught my eye. It looked like a tree trunk broken off about 10 feet up, but I didn't remember seeing such a tree there. I just kept staring at it intently, sort of jokingly wondering if it would suddenly move. When it did, it moved smoothly to its right behind a tree and out of view, almost like it finally got unnerved by my staring at it. As with my previous sighting, not clear enough to look to say for sure it wasn't a trick of light, but plenty of non-sighting evidence to support that they at least frequent the areas. I live near a very large, very popular national park. Locals here, like myself, are pretty aware of the goings-on. Strange sounds, strange creatures, and strange disappearances. I have dealt with these myself in the past on hikes and even just relaxing in the park. Here's one that still freaks me out to this day. I was at my grandma's house that's deep in the boonies. Their only road there is a gravel road that is pretty much washed away, so without a good car, you're not getting out there. My cousins lived in a trailer with their mom right below my grandma's. We played all sorts of games, which mainly involved me getting chased since I was the youngest. My grandma was in the hospital with my aunt, so our older cousin, who I'll name Dee, had to watch us. Dee was and still is the only cousin that's older than us we still hold in high regard. The whole day we spent playing around, but we would usually play more at night, like hide and seek and tag. We had been playing pretty far away from the house, and it was starting to get dark. We decided to go back to the house and grab flashlights and play manhunt. Of course, I was the one being hunted again. I ran pretty far into the woods on the other side of the property and hid behind a log. I heard my cousins getting close, so I ran and they saw me. We ended up running to the very back of the property, almost a mile from the house, and we saw my cousin Dee. He looked at us and kind of growled, and we all ran from him, thinking it was a game. We ran back on to the gravel road, and we saw him walk out of the tree line, but he did it in sort of a weird kind of gloating way. We ran into the house and decided to barricade the door to play a prank on him. We moved a couple of things in front of the door, but decided to move the big coffee table in front of it, too. As we loudly scooted the table across the floor, he came into the living room from the master bedroom, rubbing his eyes. We'd obviously woke him from all the movement, and he was mad. We told him about seeing him chase us, and he got wide-eyed. He told us to go to our bedroom and stay there. We sat in the bedroom for about 20 minutes, and he came in and told us not to worry, that it was just him scaring us, and we went on with the night. It wasn't until about 3 years later, when I was 13, that he told me the truth. It was a skinwalker. He told me that he had dealt with it when he was here at our age, and told me his story. This happened around the mid-90s. Dee, much like me and my cousin, spent his childhood around my grandma's property with his brother C and cousin K. They would play manhunt and tag and such like we did. When this story took place, it was the middle of the summer, and he was around 12. He and C and K were playing at a treehouse that is no longer standing. They had just pulled a prank on K and were hiding from him in the treehouse. D and C stayed in the treehouse until K stopped looking. C left and went back to our mama's house and left D alone. D stayed up at the treehouse and read some comics. The treehouse was about half a mile from the house and was on a hill so that you could see the house from it, but it was still in the woods. At that time, my papa was still alive, but was in Georgia on a retreat, so he was not there, which led the three boys to do what they wanted. Papa would holler for them to come home when it started to get dark, because there was, and still is, a large number of coyotes and bears around the property. Dee decided to read comics all day, something he still enjoys, and eventually he fell asleep. He woke up and it was dusk. He heard our mama yelling for him and he began to get ready to leave. As he went down the ladder, he heard Coyote yip and he climbed back up. At this point, he began to get a little upset when telling me this story. He began to explain what the coyote looked like, and I realized it was the same one that me and my cousins had been seeing growing up as well. It looked like it had mange. It had large tufts of fur missing on its right side, and you could see the bare, pale skin, and it had human-like eyes. It snarled at him and bore its teeth. He was taken aback by this, and he just sat back, down in the treehouse. The coyote sat at the base of the ladder and just looked up at him. He told me he sat there for about 20 minutes, trying to figure out what to do. He remembered he had a slingshot and decided the best course of action would be to try and scare it off with that. He said he shot at it, and it just growled more. My cousin was, and still is, a very good shot with the slingshot. I had a couple of bruises to prove it. He reared back and decided to aim at its eye because he didn't like the way it stared at him. He reared back and got it right in its left eye, and it ran away, yowling. Dee got a little more emotional now as he told me this. He told me he climbed down the ladder and made a mad dash toward the house. About halfway to the house, there was a large dip in the land where there was a bunch of bushes and small trees. When he was about there, he told me that he heard the coyote yips all around him and swore that a whole pack had come upon him. He just ran for it, and while he was on his way up the other side of the dip, he tripped and hurt his leg. He started to get upset and had to stop a few times at this point. He told me he got up and started to limp toward the house, and this is the part that gave me chills. He told me that he turned around and looked behind him and saw not a coyote anymore, but a human person, and it looked like it had a face. He said he started to walk towards him in an odd way, but luckily C and K started yelling for him, and as quickly as it appeared, it disappeared. D told C and K they didn't believe him, and they told him it was just a trick of the night, something that he still tries to believe in. As soon as he told me this, he kindly asked me not to ask him about it anymore, as when he thinks about it, he thinks he sees that coyote outside. D is very religious and a reliable man, so when he says weird stuff is happening, I usually believe him. The coyote he saw that night, me and my cousins have seen before as well, along with a stag. Since that night me and my cousins saw it, I've had 2 more encounters, the latest one being last year. I just come to find it so strange that weird things happen out here in these remote areas. We lived in New Mexico at the time. My son Cody was riding along with his friends, Drew and Alex. They were in Drew's truck and Drew was driving. It was night and they were heading to Drew's house. Drew lived out in the country, so the road that they were on was isolated and surrounded by desert. In fact, that whole area is flat and mostly dirt. As they were driving along, they see a man standing in the middle of the road. Drew slows down, and they all expect the guy to move off to the side. The guy doesn't move. He just stands there. Drew slows to a stop. The guy is standing just outside the light from the headlights. He's wearing jeans and some sort of long-sleeve shirt. They couldn't make out the features of the guy's face, but they could tell that he was facing them. Nobody moves for a few seconds. The kids start to talk about going around him, but aren't sure if they should pass by this guy, turn around, and go the other way. Suddenly, the guy drops to all fours and starts running towards the truck. All the kids start screaming. Drew slams the truck into reverse and floors it. Now they're going backwards on this dark country road, and this guy is chasing them on all fours. And he's keeping up with the truck. Drew goes faster, and finally the guy drops out of sight. Drew turns the truck around, and they all came back to the house. I was in the living room when they came running in, slammed and locked the door, and went tearing up the stairs to Cody's room. I went up to see what was going on, and this is when they told me the story. I've never seen them so pale and frightened. They were completely freaked out. This happened on a Friday night around 8 p.m. These were kids that normally would rather be anywhere except home on a weekend. That weekend they stayed at our place the whole time. They didn't go out at all, and they only left because they had school on Monday. It took a month before they wanted to go out again at night. They would go anywhere during the day, but at night they usually gathered at our house. After a little research, they all agreed that it was a skinwalker. Even to this day, if I bring up that night, Cody and his friends will get really quiet and look scared. It took a long time for them to get past it, and they still think that talking about it will make it come back. It was a beautiful, crisp spring day, perfect for my solitary trek. I was an avid hiker, always craving the solitude of the woods over the tumult of the city life. The day's destination was an uncharted route, untouched by man, teeming with its verdant allure. As I ventured deeper into the forest, the dappled sunlight played tricks with my eyes, casting long, eerie shadows in between the towering tranquility, which sent an uncanny shiver down my spine. I shook it off, attributing my unease to the unfamiliar trail. I continued my journey, the twittering of unseen birds and the rustling of leaves underfoot my only companions. I encountered a small creek, its waters murmuring a lullaby to the rocks it kissed. I paused for a moment, soaking in the tranquil melody of nature before pressing onwards. As I ventured deeper into the wilderness, a feeling of isolation began to creep over me, each stride taking me farther away from the world I knew. The air grew colder, and the sunlight less forgiving. A thick mist started rolling in, cloaking the trees in a haunting veil of mystery. Suddenly, the chorus of woodland critters fell to a disquieting silence. An inexplicable tension gripped the air. I froze, my senses heightened, my heart pounding in my chest. Straining my ears for a sign of danger, my attention was caught by rustling sound behind me. Slowly I turned, and my breath hitched in my throat. There, at the edge of my vision, was a deer. It was alarmingly large, its powerful frame oddly distorted, and its antlers were gnarled, looking more like branches of an ancient dead tree. Its fur was an unnatural hue, a sickly shade of gray, matted and patchy. But its eyes, those eyes were what struck the deepest chord of fear within me. They were not the usual warm brown of a deer, but a piercing, icy blue, glowing ominously in the foggy light. There was an eerie intelligence in them, an unnatural awareness that no deer should possess. It was as if it was looking right through me, understanding me, studying me. I felt like prey, exposed and vulnerable under its chilling gaze. A bolt of primal fear shot through me. My mind screamed at me to flee, but I was frozen in place, ensnared by the deer's intense scrutiny. It took a step closer, a low, guttural growl resonating from its chest. sending a fresh wave of terror crashing over me. Suddenly, it reared on its hind legs, an action so profoundly disturbing, so opposite of what nature ordained, that my mind reeled in disbelief. Its growl deepened into a haunting, otherworldly sound that echoed through the forest, silencing the remaining whispers of nature. In my fear-induced paralysis, I managed to fumble for my camera, as if knowing what I was doing. The deer paused, its terrified gaze locked onto me as I snapped a photograph, its eyes reflecting a horrifying glow. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the deer turned and vanished into the thick undergrowth. The forest seemed to exhale, releasing me from my paralyzing fear. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to comprehend what had just happened. There was no logic, no rational explanation that could account for such an encounter. With trembling hands, I glanced at the photograph on my camera, hoping it might shed some light on this mystery. Image on the screen made my blood run cold. There in the captured frame was a deer, its eyes glaring with an unnatural light. What made my heart skip a beat was the faint, shadowy figure looming in the background, figures that I hadn't noticed before, looking eerily human, but distorted, just like the deer. The forest, once my sanctuary, now seemed like a den of nightmares. A chill ran down my spine, and I realized I was not alone in this wilderness, and the entity I had encountered was far from natural. It felt as if the forest was holding its breath, hiding darker secrets within its silent depths. As the light of day began to ebb away, I knew one thing for certain. I needed to get out of the forest before night fell, because there was something out there in the wilderness, something that didn't want me there, and I had a feeling that it would stop at nothing to ensure that I never set foot in its realm again. I had to fight the urge to drop my camera and run. The instinctual part of me, the part that reacted to danger, was screaming to flee, but my rational mind was holding me back, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. In an attempt to calm myself, I took a deep breath, the once comforting scent of pine now tainted with a hidden dread. The silence of the forest seemed to close in around me, each creak, a branch, or rustle of a leaf sending me into a state of high alert. Suddenly, a guttural roar echoed through the forest, freezing my blood. It was the same otherworldly sound I had heard from the deer, but it was closer now, too close. Without thinking, I turned and bolted, my body acting on pure, primal fear. I sprinted through the dense undergrowth, branches whipping against my face as I pushed forward, my lungs burning for air. Fog had thickened now, obscuring my path. Forest had turned into an impenetrable labyrinth, an endless expanse of shadows and mist. Every step I took seemed to take me deeper into the forest. The familiar trail was nowhere in sight. Suddenly, my foot caught on a hidden root, sending me sprawling to the ground. A sharp pain shot through my ankle, but fear was a powerful motivator. Ignoring the pain, I picked myself up and kept moving. I could still hear the sound of my pursuer in the distance, a chilling reminder of the terror that lurked in the shadows. I could feel the forest watching me, its gaze as haunting as the deer's. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig echoed like a predator's growl in my terrified mind. As I hobbled on, a glimmer of hope pierced through the heavy mist. Up ahead, I could see the faint outline of a cabin, an old ranger station that had been abandoned for years. My heart pounded with a mix of relief and fear, relief at the prospect of shelter and fear of what might be waiting inside. But I had no choice. I needed to take that chance. Summoning my last reserves of strength, I pushed on, my heart hammering in my chest, the roars in the distance growing louder, closer. The door of the cabin was slightly ajar. I rushed in, shutting the door behind me with a deafening bang. I was enveloped by darkness, only light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The cabin smelled of damp wood and decay, the scent of abandonment. I tried to steady my ragged breath, straining my ears for a sound outside. The forest was unnaturally quiet. As I slumped down against the door, my heart still pounded. I knew I was far from safe. But for the moment, I was hidden from the horrors that lurked in the woods. My hands trembled as I looked at the last photograph I had taken, the shadowy figures looming ominously. Whatever was out there was not just in the forest. It was part of the forest. As darkness fell, I knew I was trapped in a nightmare that was far from over. My only hope was to survive the night, to confront whatever was waiting for me with the break of dawn. Until then, I was a prisoner in my own fear, surrounded by the unknown terrors of the forest. The cabin, despite its discreet state, provided an illusion of safety that was too precious to ignore. The dust-laden air was stale, and the musty scent of old wood filled my nostrils. After I'd caught my breath, I set about making the cabins as secure as possible. I found an old rotten table which I pushed against the door, the wood creaking ominously under the strain. I sealed the cracked windows as best I could with old, moth-eaten curtains I'd found tucked away in a corner. Every sound I made seemed magnified in the oppressive silence, a stark reminder of my isolation. My ankle throbbed with a persistent pain, but the adrenaline rush had kept the worst of it at bay. I found an old rag and wrapped it around the swelling, wincing as the pressure amplified the pain momentarily. The eerie quiet of the forest was periodically pierced by that haunting, guttural roar, chilling my blood each time. Each roar seemed closer, a morbid countdown to an encounter I dreaded. My mind whirred with thoughts of escape, of survival. My body was too drained, too battered to comply. I was trapped, and I had no choice but to face whatever was coming. As the day gave way to moonless night, the cabin was plunged into an inky darkness. The only light came from a screen of my camera, casting long, frightening shadows that danced on the old wooden walls. It was in this forbidding atmosphere that I spent the longest night of my life. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind against the window panes, every whisper of the forest sent my heart racing. Time seemed to crawl as I sat there in the darkness, my senses on high alert, straining to pick up any sign of danger. Despite the dread gnawing at me, exhaustion began to take hold. My eyelids felt heavy and my body screamed for rest. But the fear of what lurked outside kept me awake, my every nerve tingling with a fearful anticipation. In the depth of the night, something changed. The roars ceased, replaced by a haunting silence that was somehow more terrifying. It was the calm before the storm, final breath before the plunge. A shiver ran down my spine as I braced myself for what was to come. Suddenly, a low growl echoed through my cabin, sending a jolt of fear through me. It was here. With trembling hands, I picked up my camera, ready to document whatever was about to happen. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of hooves against the forest floor, slow and deliberate. Each step was like a hammer blow to my already fragile courage. I could hear the creature circling the cabin, its growl a constant echo in the stillness of the night. As I sat there, trapped and helpless, waiting for the dawn to break, I understood one thing. I was not just a visitor in this forest. I was a trespasser in the realm that belonged to something ancient, something terrifying, and it was coming to claim what was its own. The beast's growls faded into the night, a chilling lullaby in the unforgiving darkness. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, the eerie quiet stretching into what felt like an eternity. My heart pounded in my chest like a war drum, my blood running cold with every haunting echo of hooves against the forest floor. As I sat huddled in the corner, camera gripped in sweaty palms, I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was as if the creature could see through the walls, its icy gaze piercing through the darkness and into the heart of my fear. I was trapped, a mouse cornered by an unseen cat, waiting for the pounce. After what seemed like an eternity, the first rays of dawn timidly crept in through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. I had survived the night. My body ached with fatigue and fear, and my injured ankle throbbed with a renewal of vengeance. But I was alive. The forest, however, didn't share my relief. It remained quiet, its silence far from comforting. The creature was still out there, waiting, watching. Gathering what little strength I had left, I pushed the table away from the door and cautiously stepped out into the new day. The forest was eerily beautiful in the morning light, its terrifying secrets cloaked under a facade of normalcy. The path leading out of the forest seemed to mock me with its apparent simplicity. All I had to do was walk out. But I knew it wasn't that simple. The forest was holding its breath, its unseen guardians ready to pounce at the slightest provocation. The camera felt heavy in my hand, a constant reminder of the nightmare that still lingered. With trembling fingers, I scrolled through the photographs I had taken. Each one was a chilling snapshot of the horror I had endured. But it was the last image that sent a wave of icy terror crashing over me. There, standing beside the monstrous deer, were more of the shadow figures. But they weren't just looming now. They were advancing, stepping out of the shadows and into the ghostly glow of the deer's eyes. Their distorted forms looked twisted and grotesque, the forest reflecting its own malice onto them. A realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. The forest was alive. It was conscious, aware of my presence, my fear. And it was hungry, eager to consume the unwelcome intruder. Fear, however, had done its job. It had kept me alive through the night, and it would guide me out of the forest. But first I had to face the forest and its guardians. They had stalked me, haunted me, and now it was time for our final confrontation. I took a step forward, my every sense on high alert. The forest seemed to shudder in anticipation, its silent whispers growing louder, but I was not going to back down, not after everything I had been through. With a renewed determination, I started my journey out of the forest, the camera clenched tightly in my hands, ready to capture the final act of this terrifying drama. As I moved deeper into the forest, towards the path that led out, I knew one thing for certain. The forest was watching, and it was waiting. The walk back to the path was a trek unlike any other I'd experienced. The sun had begun to climb in the sky, but the forest remained cloaked in an eerie half-light. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call seemed to carry a warning. The forest was communicating, their voices in silence whisper of an impending climax. A chilling wind swept through the undergrowth, its icy fingers ruffling the leaves and sending shivers down my spine. I could still feel the piercing gaze of the unknown, watching me from the depths of the wilderness. I was not alone. I was never alone. The forest and its chilling inhabitants were my constant companions. In the distance, the silhouette of the monstrous deer emerged from the shadows. It stood there, its unnerving blue eyes fixated on me, a silent challenge hanging in the air. Behind it, the unnerving, distorted figures swayed ominously, their shadowy forms becoming more tangible, more real with every passing second. It was that moment of reckoning. It was the moment of reckoning. Summoning my remaining courage, I raised the camera, captured this final standoff. The flash seemed to momentarily startle the creature, its eyes narrowing as a long growl escaped its lips. Without breaking eye contact, I took a step back, then another, creating distance between us. The deer remained still, its gaze never leaving me. Behind it, the shadowy figures swayed as if caught in an invisible wind. Slowly, ever so slowly, I began to walk backwards, keeping my focus on the deer. The growling ceased, replaced by an eerie silence that sent chills down my spine. It felt like an eternity before I finally saw the trail, a safe passage leading out of the forest. It was within my reach, and then something miraculous happened. As my boot touched the path, a beam of sunlight pierced through the canopy, casting a golden glow around me. The brilliance of the sunlight, the deer and its eerie companions began to fade, becoming translucent, their terrifying forms melting into morning fog. I took a step onto the path, my heart pounding in my chest. As I moved further into the sunlight, the forest seemed to exhale, the whispering silence gradually replaced by the natural sounds of wilderness. The ominous presence that had plagued me was fading, the forest releasing me from its supernatural hold. I didn't dare look back until I was almost out of the forest, bathed in the safety of the morning sun. I was greeted by the sight of a normal forest, its monstrous inhabitants nowhere to be seen. As I limped towards my car, parked at the trailhead, I couldn't shake off the feeling of eyes on me. Turning around, I saw the deer one last time, standing at the edge of the forest, its form no longer terrifying, but majestic, its eyes not a haunting blue, but a warm brown. The shadowy figures were gone, leaving behind just an ordinary deer. With a final nod, it turned and vanished into the forest, leaving behind silence. Looking down at my camera, I realized it held evidence of the terrifying ordeal, testament to the uncharted supernatural wilderness. But as I scrolled through the images, I found them changed. The deer was as it should be, the shadowy figures absent, the forest looking ordinary. It was as if the forest had reclaimed its secrets, leaving behind only the memories etched into my mind. As I drove away, the forest returned to its splendid isolation, its terrifying secrets hidden once again in the facade of natural beauty. I was left with an unsettling respect for the wilderness and the unknown entities it shielded from the human realm. There were some places where man is merely a visitor, some realms where we are the aliens. I had seen one such place and lived to tell the tale. As the fear subsided, replaced by fear, I knew one thing for certain. The forest was alive, and it was watching, and having tasted its wrath once, I was content to admire it from a respectful distance. A silent agreement between man and nature. I was finally free from the haunting grasp of the forest, carrying an experience that would echo through the rest of my life. I hope you enjoyed tonight's scary stories. If you did, remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you have a story that you would like read on this channel, please send it to me at madamhorror1@gmail.com. Join me next time for more tales of the unknown.